Hello, everybody. I hope this is working. I see there are people on here. Greetings, internet people. Fortunately, I don't have great way of telling. Okay, okay, you can hear me. Awesome. Great technology. This is fantastic. Cool. Think we are good. Thank you for your patience, everybody. I know I'm like 10 minutes late here waiting on a couple of people, so that's how things go. This is session 1 of an unknown amount, getting into biblical interpretation. So I hope you find this valuable, and I'm just going to jump right in. So yeah, here we go. If you don't know who I am, my name is James Kaufman. First and foremost, I more often than not will read pre-written text. The reason being, it allows me to be most intentional with my words. And intentionality of words is a very important part of everything that we are discussing in this class. I used to do a lot of public speaking, and I would love to memorize everything that I could say to you, but the reality is I don't have time to do that. So a little bit about me. This is not my wife. This is a picture of my wife. Her name is Rebecca. She is the curator of religion and community at the Chicago History Museum. She's also the daughter of pastors Paul and Deb, or said more simply, Paul is my father-in-law, so thus I am a husband. I am also a father. I'm the father to an incredible 9-year-old boy named Bellamy. He recently moved to Chicago full-time to be with Rebecca. This is a photo of him wearing his baseball jersey in Chicago. You can see the absolute displeasure in his face of a diehard Minnesota Twins fan having to wear a Chicago White Sox jersey for the first time. We also have the greatest puppy on earth. His name is Jack, though in hindsight, I wish we had named him Chewy. I own a business called Glisten, and all of my time is spent trying to improve the lives of my employees and clients and working on cars so I can help try to improve the lives of the families that rely on this business. Thus, easily half of my time is spent on the physical, mental, and emotional energy that it takes trying to figure out how to be a father and a husband to these crazy, amazing people that I live with. The other half of my time is spent trying to run this crazy business. So yeah, a few months ago, Paul asked me to teach a study group in Israel. One thing led to the next, and now I'm teaching this class each Wednesday for the foreseeable future. Because as some of you know, this is how it goes with Paul. Eventually, you will find yourself doing something accidentally for free. Speaking of which, he just walked in. So now, another half of my time is to be spent working on this class. And so if you do the math, that math is not mathing. This is Paul, everybody. So that math isn't mathing. So don't even ask, as I have no time to explain how all this is going to work. Just know that it probably will. Now you might be scratching your head thinking to yourself, this dude works on cars and he has the audacity to stand here and say words to me. My reply is you are absolutely correct. I have no right to say anything really about anything. And now I don't have the audacity to stand before you as if I believe anything I have to say is worth listening to. I generally mean this when I say it. I've spent a significant part of the past 15 years trying to answer this question. Why should I teach anything? What gives me the right? Why should anyone listen to me? I've never come to terms with this, and I probably never will. I also run my business in the same mentality. I don't do any marketing on social media. I don't really seek attention. I do try to maintain relationships, and that's about the most you'll see me put myself out there. Um, in fact, for certain, it would be easier for me and probably you if we didn't do any of this. I'd get probably 15 hours of my week back, and you'd get your hour back on Wednesday nights. I vowed to myself a decade ago, though, I would not actively pursue opportunities to teach, but would rather only speak if asked. I rarely engage with anyone unless spoken to. It's just who I am. But one of the main themes we will see in the text as we go through it is the idea that God desires for us to be uncomfortable. That discomfort is how growth happens. I embrace discomfort, and it's why I'm very passionate about entrepreneurship. Discontentment breeds innovation. Discomfort breeds faith. This is why I run a business. This is what entrepreneurship is. Paul asked me to do this, and so here I am. I'm voluntarily half of my waking time for no real benefit to myself to do this. I say that because I'm not 100% convinced about what I have to say. So if you take issue with anything at all, I ask for grace, mercy, forgiveness, and a baseline understanding that none of this is simple, and it would be way easier for me to not be here than it is for me to be here. So if you find this class to be of no value, I ask for understanding. And also take your complaints to Paul.
I'm glad to be here and you're amazing. That's why.
I started my business 10 years ago in a very abrupt fashion, at the epitome of extreme frustration, at the summation of a period of time in which all I did was think about the biblical text, having spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to do so. I had spent years and years studying, dissecting, processing, struggling, deconstructing the text. When I was about 10 years old, I would sit in my room reading the text and just begging God, praying to God to grant me wisdom to understand it. I desperately wanted to know what it meant. I was obsessed with studying the Bible and loved looking at pictures of archaeological finds and biblical maps. On my 11th birthday, we went to church, and the pastor had stood me up in the middle of the sanctuary. I found myself surrounded by 1,000 people. The pastor said that I was going to be a Bible teacher and asked everybody to pray for my future ministry. I'll never forget this deep sense of pride I had in that moment from all of this attention. I remember thinking, this is what God has called me to do. I was the poster child of late 90s, early millennia evangelicalism. I was going to church 5 to 6 days a week. I was attending Hosanna, Berean, Celebration, Destiny Christian Church, Friendship Church, Crystal Lake Southern Baptist, Celebration Church, Shepherd of the Valley, Mount Olivet. I went to private school at Christian Life for a bit. I was mostly homeschooled and attended Christian co-ops, just to name a few of the things that I did. I'm not joking. I was all over south of the river churches from 1998 to 2007. I didn't care which denomination. Church was my hobby. I absolutely drank the Kool-Aid. And I tried so hard to live according to my beliefs. I was way stuck in my head, full of knowledge, prideful of believing I was right, willing to debate anyone. Even people 4 times my age. I sought it out and I looked for it. I was a complete asshole. Sorry, but it's just it's just true. So by the time I turned 15, I can remember thinking that I knew more about the Bible than anyone I had met, and seemingly would meet. I felt very content with what I believed I knew and was conceited for it. But then in the fall of 2006, my mom forced me to go to a synagogue, and I was very angry about it. We were going to services Friday night and Saturday mornings. The services were also 3 to 4 hours long. I absolutely hated it. I firmly believed it was a cult. I found no value because I knew Jesus had done away with everything Jewish. I did everything I could to be miserable being there, and I absolutely did not want to go. But I was also intellectually curious. And as angry as I was inside for having to be there, I also could not help myself but listen. And I'll never forget, about 3 weeks after we started attending, they had a guest teacher come teach a class. He stood up in front of the class and he said, Judaism never believed in the means of salvation through works. The keeping of God's commandments was never understood to be the means of salvation. The sacrifices in the temple were never performed for the forgiveness of sins. The keeping of Sabbath would not save you. Salvation through grace alone was first given at Mount Sinai in the book of Exodus. When I first heard these words, my stomach churned at the thought that perhaps everything I thought I confidently knew about the biblical text might be wrong. I sat in my pew as still as possible. My heart was thumping, my mind was whirling. I couldn't move because my insides were in chaos. I was thinking, if this is true, then what is the New Testament talking about? If this is true, then why does it matter what one does? What was the point of the commandments if they weren't kept for the means of salvation? If Judaism doesn't believe morality is the means of salvation, then why did Jesus come? I thought the whole point was in the Old Testament, people had to try to keep God's commands in order to be saved. They had to do sacrifices just right in order to achieve forgiveness. One mess up and bam, you're going to hell. That this was a broken system because nobody was perfect. This is the whole premise of the theological concept of original sin. So God sent his son Jesus to be sinless and die for the forgiveness of sins, as long as a person accepted this gift of salvation before they died. And in doing so, we were no longer under the old covenant or the law and not bound to the law for the forgiveness of sins. This is what I had been taught. This is what I had believed. This is what I understood to be Christianity. It was the whole point. I was thinking, if this is true, the entire foundation as to why Jesus came, died, and resurrected, the foundation of the gospel and the New Testament is predicated on Western assumptions about Judaism that may not be true. That being that the keeping of the commandments found in the first 5 books of the Bible, also known as the Torah, that keeping the commandments is how the Israelites were saved before the coming of Christ. This is the universal official doctrine as taught by all sects of Christianity. Except it could be Judaism never believed this, and in fact believes the opposite. That being, if salvation exists, it is entirely and exclusively by the grace of God. I knew in this moment upon hearing these words, sitting in that pew, everything I thought I knew would change, if it was true. I mean, if this is true, doesn't it kind of make the entirety of Martin Luther and the Reformation a bit shallow? It would be like me in 2015 going to my grandpa and saying, Grandpa, I discovered this incredible band called the Beatles. You probably haven't heard of them, but I think you'd really like them. I'll send you a Spotify playlist so you can listen to them. My grandpa would probably look at me and think, who does this kid think he is? Like, maybe Luther didn't say anything new. Like, if this is true, doesn't this challenge, in essence, the entirety of the essential identity of Protestantism, and thus why Western history has played out the way it has the past 500 years? I can truthfully say I spent the entirety of my life since that moment continuing to learn and contemplate this matter. Sitting in that pew, hearing these words, it was like I took the red pill from the Matrix. I ended up going to Israel for the first time 6 months later. Genuinely, my entire life changed after that trip. I wouldn't say I was confident in what I thought I believed. More so, I was significantly obsessed with what is now understood as deconstructionism. It was like I no longer needed to be right about the Bible, but that I had perfectly true theology, because I had a million questions and I needed to find answers to, and I didn't know how. I don't know how. But that's what I had set out to do. I had the false assumption that if anyone who professed to being a Christian, that meant they also had the same baseline foundational obsession with the Bible that I did. And I couldn't shut up about the things I was learning. And I tell you what, I never experienced more hatred from anyone than what I encountered from evangelical Christians once I opened that can of worms of actively trying to question what the Bible was about with people that I thought knew better. In hindsight, I could have saved myself a lot of pain and a lot of money if I had learned sooner what I know now. Absolutely, if I had just concluded atheism, instead of attempting to rectify a new framework of belief, it would have been easier. But I digress. I took out tens of thousands of dollars in school loans and got a degree in biblical theology and hermeneutics and ancient Near Eastern history. So this is why I work on cars today. I've always said, had I not gone to college, I would have no way of knowing I should not have gone to college. I also used to say that the process of paying my school loans back was going to kill every motive and passion I had for why I went to school in the first place. And I would say now both of those things are true. I wanted to get a PhD in biblical theology, ancient Near Eastern history, hermeneutics, and philosophy. I believed while I was in college the best way for me to ask the questions I wanted to ask and hopefully try to answer was if I had the best credentials I could get. I wanted to be like the Apostle Paul. He lays out his credentials for being a Jew's Jew in the book of Philippians. I believe I have no right to say anything I could say without meeting this standard. I wanted to be a Christian's Christian. I had lists of theologians and historians I wanted to go study with. I figured the best way to find the answers I was looking for was to be able to do what I am doing now, but under the authority of lists of academic affiliations and PhDs. But instead, I experienced what can be the corrupt, power-hungry, greedy system that is academics and Christian institutions. It also didn't help that halfway through my degree, what would have been a master's degree in ancient Near Eastern history and biblical geography, I had to leave the school I was attending in Jerusalem, and the Israeli IDF banned me from the country for 4 years for overstaying my visa. But that's a long story for another time. Upon graduating college, once my school loan payments kicked in, I had to put my head down and grind to pay bills. And boy, have I been grinding the past 10 years. And so, no, I don't get to stand before you today saying what I have to say, being an expert scholar in the fields that would give me the authority to propose what I am proposing. But I no longer value these academic institutional standards and hold no weight in them. For all the ostracizing I experienced at the hand of Christianity all those years ago, and now I'm fairly convinced when I say this, I was right then, and we are seeing the effects of it today. If you were a child of 90s evangelicalism, more than likely those beliefs have failed you. Far and away, I talk to more people who either have fully deconstructed their beliefs to agnosticism or are actively doing so now than anyone who has continued to believe the core teachings of evangelicalism of the past 20 years. It was very, very easy for me to deconstruct Christianity because of what I learned about the Bible. But I also was desperate for reconstruction. And after 12 years of intentionally sitting on the sidelines, actually not even being in the stadium, I find myself inadvertently having more and more and more conversations with people who seem to finally be ready to hear what I was trying to say 15 years ago. Go on TikTok and you will find millions and millions of videos of people from my generation who have adequately deconstructed Christianity down to the bone. Thus, everything I am saying is in essence my own opinions. Trust me, I would love to be a pastor or a scholar or a professor working in this field to have the right to say anything about the Bible or have the time to prove what I'm proposing in a proper academic standard. But I simply do not have the time or money, and I've accepted that. And also, those institutions aren't helping anyone anyways. So now I work on cars, and so here we are. So what are we doing here? This class is about options. It's about the spectrums of possibilities of interpretations of the biblical text. I'm attempting to offer what I hope is a theory that this text is meaningful for everybody, regardless of their religious or spiritual beliefs. If you assume some things that I think are very reasonable to assume based on human behavior today, I hope to present that this book has immeasurable value, and the book itself allows for this type of fluidity in its interpretation, that it accounts for it. And in doing so, this book is exceptionally graceful, exceptionally beautiful, exceptionally life-giving, and that is its very nature. Its very goal and its very intent, to present a framework for the preservation of life. So with that, let's begin. But first, we need to go over some rules. Not right now. As established, I have no authority, so please be graceful in any criticism and take anything with a grain of salt. But my hope is that you find value and meaning in what I can ramble about. Sometimes I might say something very poorly. It's why I try to stick to a script. Additionally, sometimes I might say something intentionally or unintentionally that isn't actually reflective of what I myself think, believe, or do. And sometimes that might not come through very clear. Sometimes I swear, and I apologize in advance. I could talk a lot about this, but bottom line, with the worlds I have to navigate, people didn't take me seriously as an adult until I was willing to cuss. It took me a long time to come to terms with, and it is what it is. To me, it's the strangest thing, especially being someone that grew up in an environment and having my mouth washed out with soap for saying words like, "See you later, sucker," in kindergarten. My intention is always to be graceful, respectful, and life-giving. I might say something that absolutely flies in the face of an essential core belief you hold. I know there are certain topics we could tread into that have caused wars. I've already walked the experiences of biting the hand that feeds me. I do not intend to create an internal crisis within your quintessential identity that defines the beliefs you hold. But I do believe every belief held by anyone ought to be free game for constructive criticism. Doubt is the filter that brings clarity to truth. I am not perfect. I might be late. We might start late, as happened today. I might talk way longer than I should. Some nights I might not be able to make it in person and, pre-record. But we should be able to communicate it adequately in advance if there's class or not, or if anything's changing. Ideally, anybody that's super interested in wanting to attend every week, we should have an email list and phone numbers to be able to send out group messages and stuff. So we can facilitate that later. I have no expectations of anyone. I do not expect you to believe what I believe. I'm not trying to convince you of anything. I'm not interested in debate. I have no skin in the game. I don't expect you to think how I think, act how I act, communicate how I communicate, breathe how I breathe. This is not evangelism. The ideals I might hold regarding how I might think something ought to be does not mean I pass any judgment on how things are and thus on to you. For example, I don't eat pork for reasons I don't need to go into. I have zero expectations you should do the same. I simultaneously believe vegetarianism is the highest ideal and probably should be the starting point for good food consumption, but I don't practice that myself. And I also believe, while holding that ideal, that even if it reflected reality, there are circumstances where that would not be the case. Thus, I hold a belief about how I think reality ought to be that is not reflective of how reality actually is. That I do not practice myself. That is not a standard I do not judge you accordingly for. So if in that moment upon hearing those words, if you had an emotional reaction internally towards this statement that I don't eat pork or believe vegetarianism is the ideal starting point for food consumption, then please reevaluate what I just said. There isn't any need to take any of that personally. It's not a statement about you, it's a statement about me. I'm sure there are more rules I should communicate, but those are the ones that seem forthright to me at the moment. So now we can begin. Unfortunately, we still can't begin. Well, we can, but beginning may not look how you think. To be clear, we are barely going to get into the biblical text today. There are two things we need to discuss that are the foundations of literally everything. I mean it, literally everything. They are pertinent to discuss because they are one of the main components of what I believe the Bible is doing in the text. There are two words or frameworks we need to discuss to proceed forward. The first idea is hermeneutics, which we will discuss tonight. The second idea is epistemology, which we will discuss next week. Hermeneutics. Maybe some of you have heard this word before. If so, and you thought this was going to be an academically rigorous discussion on hermeneutics, I apologize because you will be disappointed. Hermeneutics is exceptionally boring. Hermeneutics is the theory and methodology of interpretation. You may think that sounds simple enough, but I promise you it isn't. In fact, the study of hermeneutics is so elaborate, there are a handful of people in the world, like 5, whose only job it is to research, debate, and teach about hermeneutics. It is an old, established field within academia, and if you are interested, for the low price of hundreds of thousands of dollars, you too can learn multiple languages and move to the UK or Germany and obtain a PhD in this exact topic. And upon graduating, not get a job and become a barista. Hermeneutics is very complicated. I'm not an expert on it. I don't claim to be. I did study specific areas of hermeneutics with my degree, but by no means anywhere near comprehensive. I probably did not study enough to be able to say what I'm going to say, but that doesn't matter because I'm going to say it anyways. Outside of breathing, sleeping, and eating, hermeneutics is probably next on the list, as every person every single day deals with the issues of interpreting communication. And I know, Joe, you know what I'm talking about because you deal with it all the time running your business. Hermeneutics attempts to address what are the subconscious and conscious things that dictate understanding and meaning within communication. For example, here are some amazing, real-life, modern-day examples of the issues hermeneutics deals with. 2,000 years from now, people will not understand the differences between a butt dial and a booty call. And this is exactly why the Bible is hard to understand. I hope I don't have to spell out for any of you what this is saying. But if you need clarification, ask a millennial or a Gen Zer. But it's a perfect example of how language creates issues regarding interpretive meaning. Roll up the window. I asked my son the other day if he understood why I say roll up the window in our car. He did not understand. And I had to explain to him we used to have cars where you had to roll the windows up, not push a button. This is a great example of how a physical action people used to do can dictate the interpretive meaning of a text. How do you interpret the word roll in this phrase? Think about it. It has nothing to do with Windows. What if I change the phrase to this? What if I just remove 2 words? Roll up. What does it mean now? Does the meaning change? If you think it changes, how do you know it changes? Here's an example I used to use all of the time. Tweet. For a very long time, the word tweet meant to sound like a bird. But then it meant posting a statement in a digital town square online. I used to think it would take a very, very long time for this interpretation issue to begin to come to light. But I think it'll become even more apparently obvious in the next decade now that Twitter is called X. I promise you, in the next 10 to 15 years, there will be examples of people that are confused from reading texts from 2011 that mention the word tweet, and someone will not understand what they're talking about. Here are a few more simple yet great hermeneutic examples. Have you booked your train tickets yet? No, sorry, you don't need to shout. I've had a really busy week. We'll do ASAP. I'm not shouting. I just wondered so we can make plans. This text is expressing how even the look and shape of letters themselves can influence interpretive meaning. How about this one? What do you think this correspondence means? How many hundreds, if not thousands of ways could you interpret the phrase, I'm here for you? Do you think you understand what this person meant in this text? Who here understands the phrase, I'm here for you? Raise your hand. How about now? Did the meaning you thought I am here for you meant change upon seeing the words Uber driver? Now, what if you didn't know what the word Uber meant? What would you do then? How would you interpret this? Maybe you'd still interpret it the way you initially did. Well, here we go. This next one is a video clip from one of my all-time favorite shows. This clip exemplifies the matters hermeneutics is seeking to address.
Hey, so this isn't matching up with this, and I'm not sure which one's right. Can you just hunt down the original for me?
Yes, me too.
Yeah, what were you saying before about the paperwork?
Me too now. Oh, stop worrying.
Kevin, do you feel okay?
Me feel good. Body strong. Sleep big last night.
Yeah, I think we should get him to the hospital.
Yeah, all right, Kev, why don't you come with us?
No,
guys,
he's fine.
He's fine.
He's always been like that.
No, he hasn't.
I mean, he's gotten worse over the years.
He's making a statement. It's an ironic comment on our expectations of him. A funhouse image of our model of Kevin.
You keep think that. Me mechanic not speak English, but he know what me mean when me say car no go, and we best friends. So me think why waste time say lot word when few word do trick.
Kevin, I appreciate what you're trying to do.
Thank.
Here we have a word code, the same way we have a dress code. And what we're talking about is basically the speech equivalent to just wearing underpants. Sometimes words need use, but need for talk.
But save time. More success.
Does it save time, though? Because we've been here for about an hour.
No me fault.
Kevin, at most, you're saving a microscopic amount of time.
Any small time make big time.
And what are you going to do with all this time?
See world.
Kevin, you can't possibly save enough time to see the world.
Kevin, are you saying see the world or sea world?
Sea world. Oceans. Fish. Jump.
Okay.
China.
No, see, right there, That's the problem with your method, because I still don't know if you're saying see world or see the world, and it's taken a lot of time to explain it.
Fine, I'll talk normally. When me president, they see. They see.
As you can see, I believe it is reasonable to assume that language itself is an extremely important factor in potentially interpreting meaning. Hermeneutics describes the framework someone is using in interpretation. So if I say language matters in determining meaning in any text, I am actually saying my hermeneutic requires certain understandings of language to find meaning. Now, you may disagree, and that certainly could be discussed. Though if you follow that thought process to its conclusion, I believe it leads to nihilism. That is the deconstruction of everything to the point of non-existence. This is why I love that clip from The Office, because you can see where that leads to. Does anyone know what this means? What does this slide say? What does it mean? How do you interpret it? Anyone? Anyone? Bueller? I believe language is a minimum standard baseline assumption that must be made in order to attempt to interpret meaningful meaning from any text. The key there being meaningful meaning. I assume that. But what else could potentially factor into a hermeneutic? One of the theories I used to want to explore in a PhD was this idea. It could be the case how you answer that question might dictate what you believe, what religion you ascribe to, what sect of a religion you ascribe to. It may be the defining trait between Christian denominations. I often contemplate if it's the single biggest distinguishing factor between all religions, especially Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. So what else could factor into interpreting meaning from a text? Language, history, culture, logic, geography, classism, politics, logistics, historical theology. This is fundamentally what this class is about. I will attempt to offer suggestions on matters of concern that might potentially, possibly affect how the biblical text could be interpreted. And we will go through specific sections of the text, trying to demonstrate how adjusting those parameters can change interpretive meaning. So now we will close this session with our very first example from the biblical text. The following example is one of my favorite examples on how language can have a massive effect on interpreting meaning from the biblical text. Just a few days ago, I was at an apple orchard and I saw this sign. Now, does anyone here know what this means? Have at it.
Typically, apple over eye is the reflection. I look at somebody and I see myself back. That's what I've been told. This sign, I don't think it's.
What does the phrase apple of our eye mean? Term of endearment. I will propose an answer. Oxford's dictionary defines this phrase as a person of whom one is extremely fond and proud. For some people, maybe that is enough meaning, and that's all you need to know. But think about this. What does the word apple have to do with the idea of fondness? Why does this make sense? And here is where we get to an important lesson about hermeneutics. If you think you understand the meaning of this definition and why it makes sense, It's because you speak English. And you are reading this phrase in English. It is an already established vernacular of English that this concept of fondness and apple of the eye are connected. Some of you who are used to this phrase, you don't even need to think about what it means, you just know. I mean, we don't ever talk about what the word the means, right? You just know. It's internalized because you speak the language. But if you dig deeper into this phrase, you might find the baseline definition in English does not suffice. So now we enter into etymology, or the study of where words come from. The use of this word for apple comes from the Old English, the apple of the eye. It was used to refer to the pupil of the eye, because the pupil was believed to be a ball and thus looked like a seed. In Old English, the word apple used to be used as a general term to describe all fruits and nuts. For example, pineapple, because it's an apple that looks like a pine cone. Or for example, in Latin, pomum granatum, which is where we get the word pomegranate, meaning seeded apple. This is also where we get the word grenade from, because grenades look like pomegranates. So Old English helps answer the question a bit. Apple of the eye equals pupil. So how does that connect to fondness? In 890 AD, King Alfred translated On the Consolation of Philosophy, written in Latin in 523 AD by the philosopher Boethius. Alfred translated the Latin from pupil to apple, because that is what it meant in Alfred's day. However, this passage from Boethius is actually a quote from Psalm 17. Keep me as the apple of your eye, hide me in the shadow of your wings. So we see now a connection between the Latin and the Old Testament text. In other words, what we ascribe in English comes from the Latin, which was translated from the Greek Septuagint by Jerome in the 380s AD. The Septuagint is an extremely important translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, translated into Greek in 300 BC. So we get a connection from English to Old English, to Latin, to Greek, to Hebrew, over 1,000 years. So the question is, what do we find in Hebrew? In Hebrew, the word that is translated into apple is ishon. Now, in another session, we will get into easy ways to research word definitions. But I will say I highly recommend looking into the software eSword. But we will discuss that more another time. So what does ishon mean in Hebrew? Do you think this has anything to do with the word apple? Ishon is translated as deepest blackness. So we could read this verse as, keep me as the deepest black of your eye. If you read that in English, it would be reasonable to interpret this as pupil, because that is the part of the eye that is black. So because in Old English, the pupil was called the apple, we now have this phrase, apple of my eye, to refer to what was being said in Hebrew as deepest black. But do you think that still explains the idea of fondness? What does the word pupil have to do with the word fondness? This is not the only meaning of this Hebrew word. Additionally, ishon is translated as little man. Why? because the root of the word ishon is ish, which means man. However, this Hebrew word for man is different than the most famous Hebrew word for man. Does anyone know the most famous word for man in Hebrew? Adam or Adam. Then God said, let us make Adam in our image after our likeness. So what is the difference between Adam and Ish? The first usage of Ish in the text is Genesis chapter 2, when the text describes the creation of Eve. Then the Adam said, this at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called Isha, because she was taken as a wife out of Ish. Therefore, Ish shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his Isha, and they shall become one flesh. So the difference between Adam and Ish is the difference between a man being a man and a man being a husband, which is why the first use of Ish only happens with the advent of Eve or Isha. Adam cannot be Isha without Ish. You can't be a husband without a wife. So let's bring this back to Psalms. Keep me as the Ishon of your eye. Keep me as the little man of your eye. Does this make sense to anyone? And now this is where we see the beauty of language as a tool of hermeneutics. The actual meaning of this phrase in Hebrew is keep me as the little man of your eye. And it is one word that is describing the idea that whatever you are gazing upon is being reflected in your pupil. And thus, when you look into the eyes of another, you see a reflection of yourself, a little version of you. And you can only experience this when you gaze directly fixated into the pupil of another human being. And in general, that sort of intimacy is ascribed to marriages. Specifically, the phrase is describing a deep, deep, intimate relationship between two people. This is where the idea of fondness is coming from. It's a phrase that spans millennia, cultures, and language. The first time in the text this phrase is used is in Deuteronomy 32. But the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob his allotted heritage. He found him in a desert land and in the howling waste of the wilderness. He encircled him, he cared for him, he kept him as the little man of his eye. The text may be describing the perspective God held for the Israelites. It's saying God's gaze never strayed from his people. God married the Israelites. This is the relationship the text is describing. It's got nothing to do with apples. Maybe. Or it could be literally describing a pupil. Or maybe it actually is about apples. Or maybe there is some secret code that only special people can know what it means. So how do you like them apples? So that is all I have for you tonight. This last slide visualizes a framework we will eventually come back to. I appreciate all of you for listening, and I hope you found some meaning and value in this session. Next week, we will discuss epistemology as another potential component that could have vast hermeneutical effects on interpretive meaning. One thing I would like for everyone to do, write down a verse or a chapter, or some biblical text that you would find interesting in exploring how hermeneutics can affect meaning, and bring it back in the coming weeks. You can remain anonymous if you'd like. I'm not promising we will get to every example, or that any given example is even something that I'm willing to discuss. Doesn't matter. If an example is proposed, if it's one that we'll be dealing with in person when we go to Israel for whoever is going, I will not use that example in this class. But I'd love to hear what interests all of you so that I can better align the teachings to what interests you. We are several weeks away from really diving into the biblical text, so please be patient, but we will eventually get there. Thank you. Yeah, so anything that you would like to go over, discuss?
Just question. One is definitely so we have everybody in our database. I'd like to do send it a weekly kind of like, hey, this is what we talked about this week. Also, if there's any notes that are relevant, we could send out in case people missed and they're not writing fast enough online or whatever.
Yeah, so this is being recorded. You can always have that. Again, I'm reading most of what I write. I don't care if you can have the whole document if you really want to, you know, like I said, in the coming weeks, part of my intention is to kind of show some ways to actually be able to, you know, especially like word studies, you know, word studies are much more doable to be able to do on your own with modern technology because there is so many interpretive tools and stuff out there. Some of the concepts we'll discuss are not easy to do on your own because they're frankly my ideas. So, you know, but yeah, yeah. So the sessions themselves are going to be like this. I'm trying to keep them to 30 to 45 minutes. Realistically, it'll be 45 minutes because it, you know, there's a lot that goes into this. Just this took me 15 hours to make. And that's from having known all this information, but to actually craft this in a way that I feel like I can communicate it where you're going to understand it, it just takes time, you know? That's probably for me the most limiting factor in what we can do. So it's like, I'm not opposed to questions. It's just my brain is in a different mentality when I'm answering questions versus when I'm trying to, you know, everything. I believe everything that I'm going to say, and it's why this takes me so much time. I believe everything I'm going to say is hopefully going to be able to answer any question that you have just through the process. You know, so the way I see this, you know, I hope that was helpful and meaningful to people, but this is like one step in a structure that we're going to be building. And ultimately, you know, again, if you're going to Israel, that's where you're really hopefully going to see the application of a lot of these things. But we'll do examples here too, especially like there's New Testament examples that I'm happy to go into here for sure. You know, because it's just a different era than what you tend to deal a lot with like in Israel, if that makes sense. So, or Palestine, depending on your viewpoints. The Levant, that's what I like to call it. Yeah, any questions pertaining to this from anyone? Yeah, right. It's been 10 years. Like I can't imagine I'm gonna have any issues with any of that, you know. Yeah. It's a story, you know, but it was all because of the revolts. I was there in 2010. So when Cairo broke out in the revolts for the Arab Spring, I was just stuck, and yeah, I didn't have an option. So I had to stay in Israel months past my visa expiring, and and yeah, so I got in a lot of trouble when I left, but I don't know what there's just nothing else I could have done about it really. So yeah, I don't think that'll be an issue. It shouldn't be. So yeah. Alrighty. Cool. Thank you for listening. Goodbye, internet people.